I'll never forget that night. It started so innocently, yet spiraled into something I could have never imagined. You know those moments that feel normal, but deep down, you sense something shifting, something you can't quite explain? That's exactly how it felt when my mom left on a business trip, leaving me alone at home with Alex, my stepdad. Alex wasn't the typical stepfather. He had this calm, confident aura, one that often irritated me, but in ways I couldn't fully understand. He was always composed, always in control, and somehow that unnerved me. But what really threw me off was how, over time, I started noticing things about him I shouldn't have. Things that made my heart race, things that made me question myself. That night, everything changed. It was quiet, too quiet. Mom had been gone for only a few hours, and yet the house already felt different. I could feel his presence, even when we weren't in the same room. It was like this invisible tension lingered in the air, something unspoken but impossible to ignore. And maybe, just maybe, he felt it too. I tried to act normal, sat down in the living room, scrolled through my phone, anything to keep my mind off the growing sense of unease. But then, he walked in. Casual, as if nothing was happening. But the way his eyes flicked toward me, just for a second too long, made my breath hitch. I told myself I was imagining things, that it was all in my head. But was it? Want something to drink? He asked, his voice steady, too steady, as he moved toward the kitchen. Sure, I replied, trying to sound indifferent, trying to hide the fact that my heart was pounding in my chest. I followed him into the kitchen, pretending to look for something in the fridge, anything to avoid meeting his gaze. But then it happened, our hands brushed when he passed me a glass of water. Just a brief touch, yet it sent a jolt through me, as if the room had suddenly charged with electricity. I pulled my hand back quickly, but the damage was already done. My mind was racing, and I could feel the tension thickening around us. He didn't say anything, just gave me that calm, unreadable look of his. And I hated it, hated how it made me feel so out of control, so vulnerable. I wanted to leave, to retreat to my room and pretend none of this was happening, but my legs refused to move. Instead, I stood there, gripping the edge of the counter, my knuckles turning white. The silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, loud and fast, as if it was trying to warn me of something. You okay? He asked, his voice softer this time, as if he could sense the turmoil inside me. Yeah, I'm fine, I lied, my voice barely above a whisper. But I wasn't fine, not even close. And that's when I realized I wasn't imagining things. There was something between us, something dangerous, something forbidden. I knew it was wrong. He was my stepdad, for God's sake. But knowing it was wrong didn't make it any less real. And the scariest part? A part of me didn't want it to stop. What happened next changed everything. But trust me, it's only the beginning. Things are about to get way more complicated, way more intense. You won't believe what's coming next. As I walked into the kitchen, I tried to act normal. Tried to pretend that everything felt ordinary. But it didn't. There was this unspoken tension hanging in the air, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. And it didn't help that Alex seemed more attentive than usual. How was your day, Lily? He asked casually, leaning against the counter with a glass of water in hand. Fine, I mumbled, avoiding his gaze. I didn't trust myself to look him in the eyes without my thoughts betraying me. We sat down for dinner, the clinking of forks and plates filling the silence. The conversation was light, too light. I could feel his eyes on me every now and then, lingering just a bit too long. Was it my imagination? Maybe I was just reading too much into it. Or maybe something had shifted. At one point, he reached across the table to grab the bottle of water, and for a brief second, the muscles in his arm flexed under his shirt. I quickly looked away, feeling my cheeks heat up. Why was I noticing things like that? After dinner, we started clearing the table together. I was reaching for a plate when our hands brushed. It was nothing, just a fleeting touch. but it sent a spark through me, sharp and undeniable. "You okay?" Alex asked, his voice low, concerned. "Yeah, I'm fine," I said quickly, pulling my hand back and turning away before he could see the flush creeping up my neck. But I wasn't fine. Far from it. My mind was racing, my heart pounding in my chest. There was something happening here, something I wasn't ready to face. And judging by the way Alex was looking at me, he felt it too. I needed to get out of there, to clear my head. "I'm going upstairs," I said abruptly, not waiting for his response. Once in my room, I closed the door and leaned against it, trying to catch my breath. What was going on with me? Why was I reacting like this? It was just Alex, calm, composed Alex, who had always been nothing more than my stepfather. So why did tonight feel so different? I tried to push the thoughts away, to convince myself that I was overthinking. But no matter how hard I tried, the image of his gaze, the warmth of his hand brushing against mine, lingered in my mind. I didn't sleep well that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him sitting across from me at the dinner table, his eyes steady, his presence overwhelming. It was as if my mind refused to let go of whatever strange thing had begun between us. The next morning, I woke up groggy, determined to act like nothing had happened. I went downstairs, ready to pretend that everything was perfectly normal. Alex was already in the kitchen, making breakfast. He turned when he saw me, a smile playing on his lips. "Morning. Want some coffee?" "Sure," I said, keeping my tone as neutral as possible. He handed me a cup, and our fingers brushed again. Just like last night, it was a small, insignificant touch. But it wasn't insignificant to me. Not anymore. "Sleep well?" he asked, his voice carrying a hint of something I couldn't quite identify. "Yeah," I lied, taking a sip of coffee to avoid meeting his eyes. But I knew this wasn't over. Something had started, something that neither of us could ignore. And deep down, I had a feeling that things were only going to get more complicated from here. That night, I tossed and turned for what felt like hours, unable to find peace. No matter how hard I tried to silence my thoughts, Alex's presence kept creeping back in. Every look, every subtle touch replayed in my mind like a film on repeat. Was I imagining things? Was he just being kind, and I was reading too much into it? Or was something really happening between us? I hated how much space he was taking up in my mind. This wasn't normal. It couldn't be. He was my stepfather, for God's sake. I needed to pull myself together, to get a grip before things spiraled out of control. Yet, no matter how many times I told myself that, the strange pull I felt toward him didn't go away. If anything, it grew stronger with each passing moment. When morning finally came, I felt drained physically and mentally. I dragged myself out of bed, determined to act normal, to keep my distance, and avoid any weird situations like the ones from the previous night. As I walked downstairs, I caught the scent of coffee and something warm cooking. The familiar hum of the kitchen greeted me, and there he was, Alex, standing by the stove, flipping pancakes. He looked up as I entered, a soft smile spreading across his face. "Morning. Sleep well?" His voice was calm, steady, as if nothing had happened. I forced a smile, trying to match his easy demeanor. "Yeah. You?" "Can't complain," he said, turning back to the stove. "Pancakes and coffee?" "Sure." I sat down at the kitchen island, grateful for the distraction of food. He poured me a cup of coffee and handed it to me, his fingers brushing against mine for a split second. Just like the night before, it was such a small thing, barely a touch. But it sent a ripple through me, and I hated how aware I was of him. "Thanks," I said, hoping my voice didn't betray how unsettled I felt. We ate in relative silence, the occasional clink of cutlery filling the air. I tried to focus on my food, on anything but the man sitting across from me. But it was impossible. Every time I glanced up, I caught him looking at me, not in a way that was obvious or overt, but with a quiet intensity that made my heart race. I needed to get out of there. The air felt too thick, too charged with something I didn't understand. As soon as I finished my breakfast, I mumbled an excuse about needing fresh air and slipped out onto the back patio. The morning was crisp, the cool air a welcome contrast to the warmth of the kitchen. I took a deep breath, trying to clear my head. But before I could fully settle, I heard footsteps behind me. "Mind if I join you?" Alex's voice was soft, almost hesitant. I turned to see him standing in the doorway, his hands tucked into his pockets. For a moment, I considered telling him I wanted to be alone. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, I nodded, and he stepped outside, closing the door behind him. We stood in silence for a while, the tension between us palpable. I wrapped my arms around myself, more out of nervousness than from the cold. Alex leaned against the railing, his eyes on the horizon. "You seemed a bit off this morning," he said finally, breaking the silence. "Everything okay?" "Yeah, I'm fine," I said quickly, too quickly. He didn't look convinced. "If something's bothering you, you can talk to me, you know." I wanted to laugh at the irony of that statement. How could I tell him that he was the reason I felt this way? That every time he looked at me, it sent my mind spiraling into places it had no business going? "I'm good," I said instead, forcing another smile. "Just didn't sleep well." He nodded slowly, as if weighing my words. "Well, if you ever want to talk, I'm here." I didn't respond, and after a few more moments of silence, he turned and went back inside, leaving me alone with my thoughts once again. But even after he left, the tension lingered, wrapping around me like an invisible thread. No matter how hard I tried to ignore it, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between us, and that it was only a matter of time before it came to a head. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I kept myself busy with anything I could find, chores, reading, even attempting to bake something just to distract myself. Anything to keep my mind from wandering back to Alex. But no matter what I did, the feeling wouldn't go away. It was like he was everywhere, in every corner of my mind, refusing to be ignored. That evening, as I sat in the living room pretending to watch TV, Alex came in and sat down on the opposite end of the couch. The space between us felt too small, too charged with unspoken tension. "What are you watching?" he asked casually, as if nothing was out of the ordinary. "Just some random show," I said, not really paying attention to the screen. For a while, we sat in silence, the only sound coming from the TV. But it wasn't a comfortable silence. It was heavy, filled with things neither of us dared to say. At one point, I felt him shift closer, just a little. It was subtle, almost imperceptible. But I noticed. And it made my heart race in a way that scared me. I wanted to move, to put some distance between us. But I couldn't. I was rooted to the spot, caught in this strange, unspoken game we seemed to be playing. Eventually, the tension became too much. I muttered something about being tired and got up, retreating to my room before things could escalate any further. As I lay in bed that night, my mind was a whirlwind of confusion. What was happening between us? Was it all in my head, or did he feel it too? And if he did, what did that mean? I didn't have any answers. All I knew was that something was building, something I wasn't sure I was ready to face. But deep down, I also knew that whatever it wasn't going away anytime soon. The next morning, I woke up feeling just as conflicted as the night before. But there was no time to dwell on it. Life went on, and I had to pretend that everything was normal, even if it didn't feel that way. When I went downstairs, Alex was already there, sipping his coffee and reading the newspaper. He looked up as I entered, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Morning." "Morning," I said, trying to sound casual. "Pancakes again?" he asked, nodding toward the stove. "Sure, why not?" I said, sitting down at the kitchen island. As he started cooking, I couldn't help but watch him. There was something about the way he moved, so calm, so confident. It was maddening. I tried to focus on something else, anything else. But my mind kept drifting back to the tension that hung between us, the unspoken words that neither of us dared to say. And as the smell of pancakes filled the air, I knew one thing for certain: this was far from over. If anything, it was only just beginning. I knew this was only the beginning. Every moment I spent near Alex felt like a test, one that I wasn't sure I could pass. There was something in the way he looked at me, in the way his presence made the air feel heavier, more charged. And the worst part? I couldn't stop thinking about it. About him. It was driving me crazy, this unspoken tension between us. He must have felt it too, though neither of us dared to acknowledge it out loud. Maybe we were both too afraid of what would happen if we did. After lunch, I decided I needed a break. I needed fresh air, space to think clearly without him being right there, making me question everything. So I went out into the backyard, hoping the cool breeze would calm my racing thoughts. But I had barely sat down on the patio steps when I heard the door open behind me. "Everything okay?" Alex's voice was calm, steady, but there was something in his tone: concern, curiosity, maybe even something more. He walked over and sat down next to me, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "Yeah, everything's fine," I said quickly, too quickly. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. He didn't say anything for a moment, just sat there, watching me. The silence between us felt heavy, loaded with everything we weren't saying. I wrapped my arms around myself, more out of nervousness than from the cold. "You sure?" he asked again, his voice softer this time, more insistent. I nodded, forcing a smile. "Just needed some air, that's all." He leaned back, stretching his legs out in front of him. "Yeah, it's been a weird couple of days, hasn't it?" I glanced at him, caught off guard by his words. Did he mean what I thought he did? Was he referring to the tension between us, or was I just imagining things again? "Yeah, I guess," I said, trying to sound casual. But my voice came out too soft, too uncertain. We sat in silence for a while, the only sound the rustling of leaves in the wind. I tried to focus on the cool air, on the feel of the wooden steps beneath me, on anything but the man sitting next to me. But it was no use. He was right there, close enough to touch, and all I could think about was how much I wanted to. I hated myself for it. This wasn't supposed to happen. He was my stepfather, for God's sake. This was wrong, wasn't it? But no matter how many times I told myself that, it didn't change the way I felt. It didn't stop the way my heart raced every time he looked at me, or the way my skin tingled whenever he was near. "I've been thinking," Alex said suddenly, breaking the silence. His voice was quiet, thoughtful. "About what?" I asked, my heart skipping a beat. He hesitated for a moment, as if choosing his words carefully. "About how things have been between us lately." I froze, my breath catching in my throat. This was it. The conversation I had been dreading, and maybe, secretly, hoping for. I didn't know what to say, so I just stayed quiet, waiting for him to continue. "It feels different," he said finally, turning to look at me. "Like something's changed." I swallowed hard, my mind racing. Should I deny it? Pretend I didn't know what he was talking about? Or should I be honest and admit that I felt it too? "Yeah," I said softly, barely above a whisper. "It does." For a moment, neither of us said anything. We just sat there, the weight of our unspoken feelings hanging in the air between us. And then, slowly, he reached out and took my hand. It was such a simple gesture, but it felt like so much more. His fingers were warm against mine, his grip gentle but firm. I should have pulled away. I should have said something, anything, to stop this before it went any further. But I didn't. I couldn't. Instead, I tightened my grip on his hand, silently telling him that I didn't want him to stop. "This is crazy," he said quietly, almost to himself. "But it doesn't feel wrong. Does it?" I shook my head, unable to find my voice. No, it didn't feel wrong. It felt inevitable. I don't know what this means, I said finally, my voice trembling. I just know that I can't stop thinking about you. He let out a soft breath, his eyes searching mine. Me neither. For a long moment, we just sat there, holding hands, caught in this strange, impossible moment. And then, slowly, he leaned in. I knew I should stop him. I knew this was crossing a line we could never uncross. But when his lips brushed against mine, all rational thought disappeared. All that mattered was the way he made me feel alive, electric, like nothing else in the world mattered except for this moment. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, as if we were both testing the waters. But it didn't stay that way for long. It deepened quickly, becoming something more urgent, more intense. His hand moved to the back of my neck, pulling me closer, and I found myself leaning into him, wanting more. When we finally pulled away, we were both breathless, our hearts racing. This is insane, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Yeah, he agreed, a small smile playing on his lips. But it's real. I didn't know what to say. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions, fear, excitement, confusion, desire. This was something I had never expected, something I didn't know how to handle. But one thing was clear, there was no going back now. Where do we go from here? I asked, my voice trembling. We figure it out, he said simply, his thumb brushing against my hand. Together. And as crazy as it sounded, I believed him. Somehow, we would figure this out. Because whatever this was, it wasn't going away. If anything, it was only just beginning. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur. We didn't talk about what had happened, didn't acknowledge the kiss or the feelings that had led to it. But the tension between us was different now, heavier, more charged, like a storm waiting to break. By the time evening came, I felt like I was walking on a tightrope, one misstep away from falling into something I couldn't control. And yet, despite the fear, there was a part of me that didn't want to stop. That wanted to see where this would lead. When Alex suggested watching a movie, I agreed, hoping it would help distract me from the chaos in my mind. But as we sat together on the couch, the space between us too small, too intimate, I knew that distraction was impossible. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. If anything, it was only the beginning of something far more dangerous and far more thrilling than I could have ever imagined. Did something happen? Alex asked again, his voice quieter this time, his hand gently brushing against mine. I tried to avoid his gaze, tried to convince myself that if I didn't look into his eyes, this feeling, the pull between us, would fade. But it didn't. Instead, when our eyes met, it felt like the ground beneath me shifted. Something changed in that moment, something neither of us could ignore any longer. He leaned in, slow and hesitant, as if giving me a chance to back away. But I didn't. I couldn't. Every part of me screamed that this was wrong, that I should stop it before it went too far. But the louder voice, the one I couldn't silence, whispered that this was inevitable. Our lips met, soft at first, testing the waters. It was like we had both been waiting for this moment without realizing it. His hand slid around my waist, pulling me closer, and in that instant everything else melted away. There was no past, no future, just this. Just us. I didn't know how long the kiss lasted. Time seemed to stand still, stretching and folding in on itself. When we finally pulled apart, we were both breathless, our hearts racing in sync. I started, my voice barely more than a whisper. This changes everything. Alex didn't say anything for a moment, just looked at me with an intensity that made my pulse quicken all over again. Yeah. It does. That night, we didn't talk much. We just sat there, side by side, wrapped in the quiet aftermath of something we couldn't take back. I expected to feel regret, guilt, something that would remind me of why this was wrong. But all I felt was calm. And maybe a little excitement. Because deep down, a part of me wanted this. Wanted more. I didn't sleep well. Every time I closed my eyes, I could still feel his lips on mine, his hands on my waist. I kept replaying the kiss over and over in my mind, wondering what it meant for us. Where did we go from here? Could we even go back to the way things were before? Morning came too soon, and with it, the weight of reality. As I made my way downstairs, I tried to convince myself that we could just pretend last night never happened. But as soon as I saw Alex standing in the kitchen, his back to me, I knew that wasn't possible. He turned when he heard me, a small, almost shy smile playing on his lips. "Morning." "Morning," I replied, my voice barely steady. We didn't say anything else as he handed me a cup of coffee. Our fingers brushed, and just like last time, it sent a jolt through me. I hated how aware I was of him, how much I wanted to close the distance between us again. But we didn't. Not then. Instead, we sipped our coffee in silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts. Later that afternoon, I found myself alone in the living room, flipping through channels without really watching anything. My mind kept drifting back to Alex, to the way he made me feel alive, electric, like nothing else mattered. I didn't hear him come in until he was standing right behind me. I turned, surprised to find him so close. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice careful, measured. "Yeah," I said, setting the remote down and turning to face him fully. He sat down beside me, the space between us too small, too charged with tension. For a moment, neither of us said anything. Then he took a deep breath, as if steeling himself for what he was about to say. "I don't know where this is going," he admitted, his voice low, almost hesitant. "But I know I don't want it to stop." His words hit me harder than I expected. Because as much as I had been trying to deny it, I felt the same way. "I don't either," I said softly, my heart pounding in my chest. "But what does that mean? What happens now?" He reached out, taking my hand in his. "I don't know. We figure it out. Together." The days that followed were a blur of stolen moments and unspoken feelings. We didn't talk about what we were doing, didn't try to put a label on it. But it was there, in every glance, every accidental touch that lingered just a little too long. One evening, as we sat on the couch watching a movie, I felt him shift closer. Our arms brushed, and neither of us moved away. Instead, he reached over, his fingers lightly brushing against mine. I turned to look at him, and for a moment, everything else faded away. "I don't want to keep pretending," he said quietly, his eyes searching mine. "I want this. I want you." His words sent a shiver through me, and before I could think better of it, I leaned in, closing the distance between us. This kiss was different from the first, deeper, more certain, like we had both accepted whatever this was between us. When we finally pulled away, I was breathless, my heart racing. But there was no going back now. We had crossed a line, and nothing would ever be the same. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't help but wonder what people would think if they knew. Would they judge us? Would they understand? Probably not. But in that moment, I didn't care. All that mattered was how he made me feel, and I wasn't ready to give that up. And just like that, the story ends here, for now. But who knows what's next? Maybe something crazier, something we never saw coming. Would you have done the same in my place? Let me know in the comments. Because honestly, I'm still trying to figure it all out myself.